mankind attained immortality against his own will. It began with a prisoner who was scheduled to die by lethal injection. 3 successive passes in the same week proved ineffective. The guards were baffled, as were those who awaited news via the web and television. This mass murderer who had ended dozens of lives and ruined hundreds of others was unable to be killed in turn. But there were whispers that this wasn't an isolated incident. In Chicago, 2 young men were shot point blank by officers, one of whom had rounds go straight through his heart. The doctors who patched him up called it a remarkable medical miracle that he pulled through. In Denver, a woman's throat was slit by her mugger. While she laid on the pavement spewing crimson for nearly 2 hours, she somehow survived, even though when aid found her she had nearly exsanguinated. Technically, it was impossible for a human body to still be alive in this condition. Without blood flow to the vital organs, everything would have shut down. But after she came to and had fluids pumped into her, her brain, heart, liver, lungs, and kidney all functioned, though were severely weakened. Despite the other sightings and rumors of sightings, this woman was the first person to receive the media nickname Death Proof. Her 15 minutes of fame, however, were over quite quickly. A terror attack hit a London subway. Suicide bombers exploded vests filled with plastic explosives on the subway. The result should have been catastrophic, but as relief came to clear out the broken bits of the underground in order to recover the bodies, they found a train full of very alive body parts. Heads disconnected from torsos, yet still breathing. Arms and legs embedded into glass and concrete, still twitching wildly. And perhaps most disturbing of all was the nearly completely immolated bodies of the terrorists, who were left as charred bits of flesh that somehow wriggled with understanding of their surroundings. Of particular note, one EMT found a single charred eyeball that was still able to roll around as though it were inside of a head. The governments of the world didn't know how to respond. They would have attempted a cover-up, certainly, but how can one cover up the fact that all mankind seems suddenly impervious to death? In a just world, pain might have also ceased with the absence of death, but alas, that was not the case. The victims of the subway bombings were pieced back together and were going to be buried. People didn't want to think of a world where what had remained was still able to walk around. Despite the wailing and begging of those inside the coffins, they were lowered into the earth and hidden with the hope that gods would find them. A man in a Belfast hospital was making an attempt at euthanasia, as his ALS had progressed to the point where his lungs had stopped working. He was unable to kill himself, but unable to breathe. This was when people really began to take charge of the new reality. Death was one thing, but living on, with whatever pain you would feel at the end, perhaps for all time, was a new kind of hell that people could not abide. Crime temporarily screeched to a halt, as nobody wanted to end up like those terrorists or their victims. There were still crimes of passion, or people acting out of desperation. But in time, when death was welcome, the governments of the world had held control, and now it would be no different. Imprisonment was still a deterrence method, of course, but new punishments were pushed through in various parts of the world that took sick advantage of the new state of things. In Brazil, the crime for murder was the removal of limbs. Arms and legs would go and be encased in concrete and buried, while the torso and head was set free. In Pakistan, the local government got more creative and invoked a policy of decapitation for crimes as minor as blasphemy. The heads were removed, covered in plastic bags, and impaled on a spike pole for all to see. America, ever trying to make it seem as though they were a civilized country, refused to pass any such method that was still seen as cruel and unusual. In lieu of the death penalty, prisoners were simply buried alive in a special underground vault that was used and designed to include air holes. However, there was talk that one of the pastimes of the victims of these evil people was to find these makeshift cemeteries and plug up the air holes, creating an eternity of suffocation for the entombed, yet very alive, inmates. Outside the world of justice, there was a theoretical upshot. People began to take much better care of their bodies and themselves. World obesity dropped to nearly 0.001%. Advances in medicine were now the leading focus of all government budgets. Ways to live stronger and healthier were a must. People would have to live with their bodies a very long time, so any method of fighting the aging process was considered an essential bit of science. It's not to say there weren't still those who tried against hope to jumpstart death. A few scientists went rogue and began using the prison population as guinea pigs for various methods of reclaiming what they had lost. One of the first methods attempted was cremation. Nothing but ashes remained. The problem was, as it was only ash, there was no way to know for certain whether or not they had actually died or still existed in some inconceivable form. Very few were willing to test the theory. These were the first dark times, but there's a light at the end of every tunnel. One doctor finally came up with the idea to surgically extract the pain receptors from the body, severing the connection between brain and nerves. Pain still theoretically existed, but the human brain could not decode it. Once this was put to repeated tests and proved effective, this new surgery became standard, the breakthrough, for those who could afford it. Death had become eternal life, but greed had not become selflessness. Those who could afford to be pain-free protected the ones who made it possible, and a new caste system was created, as always focused around wealth and influence. If you were pain-free, the world was a new utopia. All that you had to worry about was staying healthy, and the rest of the world was like a plaything to you. But the lower class, who still faced the horror associated with eternal pain, were cast aside and ignored. These were the living corpses that we had feared in our childhoods, damned souls trying to salvage what remained of a normal life in the wake of God abandoning them. No society can last forever, especially when its success is at the expense of another, as all societies are. The rabble of suffering began massive riots, capturing these people, and unable to cause them pain, entombed them in the same caskets that had been used for the inmates. As the inquisitions and purging of the wealthy continued, however, the people began to turn on themselves as well. There is always an upper crust, and this was now the leaders who were forcing surgeons to give them the treatment. Chaos ensued about how to handle the handful of doctors who were capable of giving the treatment, and the millions requiring it. Greed took over once more, but over time the doctors became overworked. A few died of exhaustion, others were beaten to death when they insisted they were unable to work, and one unfortunate fellow had made a mistake during the surgery because of exhaustion, and removed a large portion of brainstem. He was entombed in wet cement for his failure. When the last light of hope began to fade away, pandemonium ensued. No god or devil could have created a better monument to what humanity was worth than this. An eternity of being forced to live with ourselves. This was life after death.